Hi, I'm Barry Wolf. I'm an attorney whose private practice focuses on animal law. I have here with me today Amy Pontillo. We're going to talk about therapy animals and emotional support animals and some of the exciting contexts in which they can be found out in the real world. Under the ADA, only dogs and actually miniature horses are considered to be service animals as defined. Miniature horses, you might be thinking of a large horse or something that would really seem out of place. But miniature horses are really the size of a large dog, actually. They're about a comparable size. And their advantage is that they have a much longer lifespan. An emotional support animal is not necessarily trained to perform a specific task, but an emotional support animal has been found to be medically helpful. There's been a lot of known medical benefits to therapy animals and emotional support animals. What have you heard recently about medical studies or scientific studies that help establish these benefits?
Well, so it's been known or studied for a while that being with a well-trained dog or petting an animal can help reduce the physical symptoms of stress, like lowering blood pressure, lowering heart rate, giving people the feeling that they are less stressed or more calm. But studies that they're doing currently are actually showing that it's an actual physical response to being with a therapy animal that actually reduces stress. So, for example, they did a study with students who worked with therapy animals and students who didn't work with therapy animals. And what they found was the students that worked with therapy animals actually had lower levels of cortisol when they were tested after working with the therapy animal. And cortisol is a stress hormone, and we produce it when we're in a high stress, when our bodies are feeling a lot of stress. Another thing that they found was that when humans gaze into their own dog's eyes, for example, the hormone oxytocin is actually increased in their bodies, but not only their bodies, but their dogs' bodies as well. And oxytocin is known as like the feel-good hormone, or it's also associated with bonding. For example, mothers and babies produce oxytocin, and it's a way for them to bond. So, and with that, the increase in oxytocin, the feel-good hormone, is actually related to the decrease in cortisol, the stress hormone. So working with a therapy animal or any kind of animal that you're comfortable with can actually physically reduce the symptoms of stress.
That's really interesting. And I think it's also interesting that it doesn't really matter if it's your personal dog or a therapy dog in the studies. I'm not sure if that's what the literature supports. But I think in the second study that you described with the increased levels of oxytocin, that would be more in the category of an emotional support animal, whereas students working with dogs would be in the category of therapy animals. Do you know if there's a difference, if the studies have been able to distinguish the difference between those two kinds of animals?
Well, so that's correct. The first study with the increase in the oxytocin levels, that would be with your own personal companion animal. And what they found is that, and not necessarily a finding, but if your own personal animal, I guess, has been bonded to you, so that would be an emotional support animal is your own personal animal that provides you emotional support. You just feel better being around your dog. You feel less stressed, maybe you feel more confident. And then the second study with the cortisol, they used therapy dogs, which were not the personal companion animals of the students. So in that was differentiated.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of different contexts in which therapy animals are seen. You mentioned schools. Do you know or are you familiar with other contexts in which they use therapy animals?
Sure, and actually something that's very current and very unfortunate is these like mass shootings. Actually, after the Sandy Hook event, there was a shooting down in Miami a few years ago. And in the school shootings, they've seen that they've brought in therapy dogs, and they've and I've seen like news reports where people, the victims of the shootings, have reported that they started to feel more comfortable once the therapy dogs were around. They felt less anxiety about the situation. There was one report of a patient, one of the victims in the hospital, that wasn't able to communicate with her doctor because she was just because of the trauma. And after being with a therapy dog, was actually better able to communicate with her doctor about her situation.
Wow, that's a really incredible story, and what an amazing way to be able to use therapy animals to help after these really traumatic events.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, that's really touching, especially if all the recent reports in the news.
Yeah, that definitely can be an asset in after traumatic situations and helping people recover.
Wow, that's incredible. I think there's also scenarios I've heard about in the courts in helping participants in litigation to deal with trauma and be able to tell their stories in court through the use of therapy animals. Are you familiar with any of those kinds of scenarios or uses of therapy animals?
Sure. There are some instances where a therapy animal or a therapy dog, sometimes they're referred to as facility dogs, depending on whether the dog is working with the particular DA's office and helping vulnerable victim witnesses testify in court. And the one particular case that I'm thinking of, a therapy dog helped this young girl not only in her testimony but in the forensic interviews that occurred before she was put on the stand. So it was reported that she was not able to speak to the interviewers. She, had anxiety. She had post-traumatic stress disorder. And then once the therapy dog was introduced into the interviews, she became more communicative. She was better able to speak to the interviewer, and it helped her prepare for her testimony. And then the day of her testimony, she was able to have the therapy dog with her, and it helped her to testify and feel more confident on the stand. And when you use a therapy dog in court, it's typically a judicial decision whether or not to allow a therapy dog in the courtroom while the witness is testifying.
That's fascinating. So is there any kind of formal program in the courts that would allow therapy dogs to be used, or is it in the discretion of the judge, so it's dependent on each particular proceeding or action?
From what I know, it's up to a particular judge in a particular case. I know that a few DA's offices in the city do have facility dogs, but whether or not the dog is permitted in the courtroom, it would be up to the judge.
That's really fascinating. I know we talked a little bit already about the use of therapy animals in schools. There's a recent New York City program spearheaded by the DOE. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, from what I've heard, there are therapy dogs that can be adopted by a particular teacher in particular classrooms, and that teacher can bring in the therapy dog to help assist the students in their learning. We talked a little bit about how being with a therapy dog can help reduce the physical symptoms of stress. So when kids are in a learning environment, it can be very stressful, particularly if a child has a learning disability or some kind of maybe emotional concern. So by having a therapy dog available, it actually can help the student learn better, read, because they're not getting judged if they are. Sometimes they have a student read to a dog because the student will say, I don't feel judged when I read to the dog, and it just makes me feel more comfortable. So it can actually help in the learning environment to have a therapy dog available.
That's really remarkable.
It is.
These are such cool programs. It's really fun to hear about all of the different contexts. And there really seems to be a upsurge in the amount of programs utilizing therapy dogs that you hear about these days.
I agree. I don't know if it's because I'm searching out for these programs more, or they are actually becoming more popular. But it could also be because of some of the studies that we talked about, that it's getting more and more proven that it is helpful to work with an animal, and use animal-assisted therapy in learning, but also helping to heal, overcoming stress and trauma, PTSD.
Yeah, there's really an acceptance these days in the medical literature and the medical community about the proven value of using therapy animals.
Yes, I'm definitely seeing more studies online and in the journals. For example, there was another study, and it was written about in the newspapers, and also there was a book written about it. There was this neuroscientist who studied the reactions of dogs and their brains using fMRIs. And it was a pretty cool study because all of the participants, the dogs, were willing participants. So each dog that went into an MRI machine, and if you're familiar with it, they're tight and they're enclosed and they can be kind of scary and they make a lot of noise. Each of these dogs were trained to feel comfortable in the MRI, and they would sit through an MRI and they were introduced with different scents. So they were introduced to the scent of an unfamiliar person and their owner, and a few other scents. And what they found was that the dogs, it's called the caudate nucleus, which is the reward center of the brain, and it's the same in humans as it is in dogs, would react. It would fire and activate whenever the dog was introduced to the scent of their own human. So, and it was pretty cool because the author and the neuroscientist, kind of came to the conclusion was that that dogs actually do love us because because when they're introduced to our scent, their reward center activates so much like that.
Wow, so there really seems to be a benefit for the animal as well as the human, and that's why an emotional support animal can be so positive. What other impacts can an emotional support animal have on their owner's health or their handler's health?
So, for example, somebody who suffers from PTSD or anxiety, having an emotional support animal, and of course this is different from a service animal who might, recognize a certain need in their handler and respond to it with a particular action or task, but just by being an emotional support animal could provide somebody with anxiety the confidence that she needs to maybe leave the house and go and get everyday activities done, whereas maybe that person wouldn't feel comfortable leaving the home if she didn't have her emotional support animal with her.
That's remarkable. I think it is truly amazing that just by having the simple act of having an animal around, it gives someone the ability to do something that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Absolutely. Dogs can make you, and I'm speaking of dogs in particular, but I guess and any kind of animal, but dogs can make you more communicative, more sociable, And I mean, if you have a dog in New York, you'd probably know that, if you're walking around with your dog, somebody's going to want to talk to you, or, somebody else who has a dog, you're going to probably meet other people, and it's going to make that communication and that introduction that much smoother if you have your dog with you.
Right, and these are simple things we're talking about, like just getting out of the house. But actually, when you're thinking about a disability or impairment, this is part of the activities of daily living that are inherent in such disabilities.
Absolutely, and are you talking specifically about like anxiety and PTSD as a disability, or?
Right, if you're thinking about the kind of disability like PTSD that would keep you more homebound, having a companion animal will really force you to get out of the house and to socialize, as you mentioned.
Absolutely, and you bring something else to my mind is when you maybe have anxiety or PTSD or some kind of emotional thing that's holding you back. If you have an animal that you need to take care of, you need to do certain things to care for that animal, and one of those things is going to be taking your dog for a walk, getting out of the house. So it also it gives you a sense of responsibility and something to do if you are suffering from some of those issues.
Right, and those benefits aren't just limited to disabilities that would impact your mental health. It can also be related to physical disabilities, correct?
Yes. So what are some examples that you're thinking of?
Well, for instance, having a dog and getting out of the house to walk could help with the blood pressure or other physical symptoms.
Absolutely. Could having your companion animal, your emotional support dog, by going for walks, you're helping to reduce your own blood pressure, can help you, lose weight, and also, maybe build muscle, like after you've had surgery or, or something related to a disability. It could help you physically get better.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. And are these kinds of animals just limited to dogs? We've mainly been talking about dogs so far, but can they encompass other kinds of animals as well?
Sure. I mean, under the different laws, under the federal ADA, they talk about service animals, and service animals are limited to dogs and, in some instances, mini horses. But emotional support animals could be just about anything. There's no species limitation.
And what about with therapy animals?
I believe it's the same, because I don't think that there are any legal definitions of therapy animals as of yet, as far as I know. But I don't think that they're not limited to dogs. It could be, there's equine therapy where people work with horses. It could be any type of animal.
Could you tell me a little bit about other contexts, such as hospitals or nursing homes, in which you see the use of therapy animals?
Sure. So there are programs where therapy animals can be brought into hospitals to help people heal. Mostly I've seen it in the context of dogs being brought in. And it's typically a program that is done by agreement with a particular hospital. And, it helps people physically and emotionally heal and get out of the hospital maybe quicker, or if it's, somebody who, might have to be in a hospital long term, it's helpful to have that therapy, have that animal around to, boost your spirits, like help with any kind of healing that you might need.
So therapy animals don't have an automatic right to be brought into different public places, but by agreement, and these would be specific agreements set up, they do have or are granted a right to come in.
Yes, if there is an agreement with the hospital and the particular therapy dog program or handler, the dog may be permitted, but there's no absolute right to bring a therapy dog into certain places of public accommodation, and in the specific instance, the hospital.
And what about in your home? The therapy animal or the therapy dog here has to live somewhere. Is there a right to have the therapy dog live with you?
So therapy dogs are considered companion animals. They're considered the pet of the handler in most instances. So again, they're not afforded any additional rights that maybe a service dog would be given. So as far as housing goes, it would depend on whether you're permitted to have a companion animal in your apartment.
So if I'm understanding correctly, if your building has a no pet policy, a therapy animal would not be exempt from that policy.
That's correct.
And is that the same for emotional support animals?
Emotional support animals, I believe, fall under are a different category, and if they can be assistive for somebody who has a disability, then they generally can be permitted. But I would defer to your knowledge in this topic.
Right. So, unlike therapy animals, emotional support animals are permitted as of right if you do have a recognized impairment or disability. And if your landlord or housing provider does not want to permit such emotional support animals, as well as service animals, you could make a discrimination claim in order to assert and uphold that right to have that animal with you. However, this does not extend to therapy animals who are not tied to a specific individual, because the benefit of a therapy animal is for many people, and that differs than an emotional support animal or a service animal who provides a specific benefit to a unique individual. We were just talking about a program involving dogs in prisons. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there are, I think, a few different programs where inmates in prison are, some of them are given the responsibility to raise puppies that are intended to become service animals. And from what I hear, it really gives the inmates that are given this responsibility a sense of accomplishment and having a role to have while they're in prison, something to do, and they bond with the puppies as they're growing up and training them, and it just seems like a great experience for both the puppies that will eventually become service dogs and the inmates themselves.
So in a way, the dogs in this program are really serving a dual role, both as a therapy animal for the inmate, but then also, once the training is complete, going out into the world and becoming a service animal for someone else.
Absolutely, and that's a great point, that they can be both.
Thanks so much for your time. I've been speaking with Amy Pontillo, an attorney in New York, about emotional support animals and therapy animals, as well as service animals. I hope you've enjoyed our presentation here today. Thanks for your time, Amy.
Thank you, Barry.